All right, so in this video, we're going to take a look at declining empires. So these are the older empires that we've been talking about for a while now. And for those of you that keep track of this, this is now chapter 31. And this is the chapter that is about declining empires in the Eastern Hemisphere. So in this chapter, we're going to look at the Ottoman Empire. We're going to look at the Russian Empire, who we haven't really looked at a lot in this course so far. And we're going to look at the Qing dynasty. So in this video, we're going to take a quick look back at the Ottoman Empire. Now, the last time we were in the Ottoman Empire, in time period 4, the Ottoman Empire was a strong but weakening presence in Southwest Asia. So these were the guys that the Europeans cut out from the European trade networks. And in response to that, the Ottomans turned to conservatism in order to maintain order. So if you remember from our last trip back to the Ottoman Empire, religious leaders kept new technology out. So things like observatories and printing presses. But new military technology was allowed because this helped keep order. And remember that the people that are doing this are the Janissaries. And I think that brings us up to speed on where the Ottoman Empire was when we ended time period 4. Unfortunately, as we move into time period 5, this decline continues. So because Turkish society was connected to military strength, the Janissaries had a lot of power and influence. And because the Janissaries had a lot of power and influence, they did not want anything to change. So the Janissaries now became a defender of the old ways, and a way of describing that is that the Janissaries became conservatives. And it's always dangerous when the conservatives who don't want things to change are also the guys with the guns. And so the Janissaries led several coups and overthrew governments that attempted reforms. And this is especially disheartening because the Janissaries were there to protect the government. These were the most loyal of the soldiers in the Ottoman army, and they're the ones who are overthrowing governments now as we move into the 19th century. On top of this, the Ottoman economy is now starting to break down. So it's no longer simply that the Ottomans are having to pay higher prices for European trade goods. European industrialization produces higher quality goods that are much cheaper than anything the Ottoman artisans, so people who make things, can produce. So it's so much cheaper to import European consumer goods than to produce them at home. So using a factory to make things like clothes or kitchen utensils or farming tools or anything like that, that's what the Europeans are doing. And they can produce this stuff much faster and they can produce it cheaper than anything the Ottomans can make. And so the Ottomans just start importing European consumer goods and they start exporting raw materials. This is a red flag because this is essentially what the Europeans were doing to their colonies. This is a big red flag because once you start importing European goods and exporting raw materials, you are essentially now just a colony. This is what colonies do. And once you get into this cycle, it's very, very hard to get out of it. And what's sad about it is that the Ottomans knew this was a problem. And started to industrialize like in the mid 1800s, but it was way too late. Because they had already started down this dangerous cycle. And they didn't have the money to do it either. So they made an even further mistake because the Europeans loaned them money to industrialize. And we all know what happens when the Europeans loaned people money. They get stuck in a cycle of debt bondage. Before, it was just individual Native Americans who got stuck in this. Now, the Europeans have gotten so rich that they are basically putting whole countries into debt bondage. The Ottomans couldn't pay back the loans. So the Europeans made the Ottoman Empire sign what were known as the capitulations. Capitulations are basically another way of saying that you surrender. A capitulation is a surrender. So these were treaties that exempted Europeans from Ottoman law, and instead they were subject to European law. So it wasn't like they could run around murdering people because that was still illegal in Europe. But if there were laws that were only enforced in the Ottoman Empire, Europeans didn't have to follow those laws. They also set up banks in the Ottoman Empire that didn't pay taxes to the Ottoman Empire. So they've basically caught the Ottomans in a debt trap. And it's going to be very, very hard for the Ottoman Empire to get out of this debt trap. Now, the good thing for the Ottomans is that they know that they're in this trap. So they're going to try to reform. There are some reforms. So Ottoman Sultan Selim III, and we don't need to worry too much about this guy, is going to try to reform the system. So he's going to try to reform the military. He's going to try to reform the economy. He understands that there's a problem. The problem is that the Janissaries prevent him from doing anything. The Janissaries kill the new soldiers and lock up the Sultan. The next Sultan tries to reform, and the Janissaries just kill him and most of his family. Finally, we get a sultan who is able to subdue the Janissaries. This guy, Mahmud II, actually subdues the Janissaries and eliminates them. So there aren't any more Janissaries. This is in the 1820s. And he is going to actually start to restructure Ottoman society to resemble European society. So it's going to look modern, but modern by European standards. So again, the Europeans win again because the Ottomans are just copying them. But it also means that the Ottoman Empire gets things like telegraphs and railroads. So that's good. So they're finally starting to catch up, but it's connected to all of that stuff. So they're using the money like they're supposed to, which is good, but they're also basically just copying what the Europeans did and not figuring it out on their own. This brings us to a period of time called the Tanzamot Era. So this is 1839 to 1876. And this is a period of rapid reform. Where we get most of this stuff. So we're going to get new European style law codes. We're going to get like stuff from the Enlightenment. So we're going to get political and civil rights. There were some young people, and these guys are known as the Young Ottomans, who thought the reforms didn't go far enough. And they wanted a written constitution. And they launch a coup with a new sultan who promises to follow the Constitution. And this happens at the end of this period, 1876. And as soon as this new sultan, his name is Abdul Hamid II, as soon as he gets into power, Abdul Hamid II rips up the Constitution and rules as a dictator for 30 years. So up until 1906. Oops. So when he dies, the Ottoman Empire falls into instability until 1908. In 1908, another group of young people, these people are known as the Young Turks, take over the government. And instead of wanting a European-style constitutional monarchy, the Young Turks create a nationalist government. Now, remember, the Ottoman Empire is a big empire, and a nationalist government which favors Turks over other nationalities within the empire is going to lead to conflict, like a civil war. Like, they're going to, for instance, make Turkish the official language. Which is fine if you speak Turkish, but if you're one of the other many groups within the Ottoman Empire that doesn't speak Turkish, well, then you're out of luck. And so all this does is lead to conflicts within the Ottoman Empire. And eventually, this is going to bleed into World War I. And these nationalist conflicts, and we'll talk more about this when we get into World War I, is going to lead to actual atrocities that took place during World War I. So during the war, there's going to be one of the first instances of ethnic cleansing called the Armenian Genocide. So this is going to start in 1915 and pretty much go until the end of the Ottoman Empire in 1922. So Turks are going to look at the other groups and try to either make them Turkish or try to get rid of them. And in one of the worst examples, they're going to basically kill about 1 million Armenians in the middle of World War I and claim it was the effects of the war, when in effect they're actually just killing their own people. But we'll come back to this idea when we get into World War I itself. So this is the first example of one of these declining empires in the Eastern Hemisphere, the Ottomans. In our next video, we'll look at the declining Russian Empire and kind of fill in the gaps, because it's been a little while since we've talked about Russia with any detail. So we'll spend our next video getting up to speed on what's been going on in Russia. And until then, this is Mr. Nissen signing off.